space for youth organizers to come together. And we actually had about 350 or more than 350 youth organizers and allies across the country come together, where we discussed a couple of important things in that moment, right? Like firstly, we broke into small groups. We discussed some of the immediate challenges that we're facing as young people and youth organizers in this current pandemic moment. We also started to identify some of the solutions that we as young people and young youth organizers wanted to address in the current crisis that we're facing. And then importantly, we wanted to also discuss what some of the long-term opportunities are for the work that we're doing, for the campaigns that we're developing in this particular moment, so that we don't just get stuck in responding to the immediate crisis, but also thinking about the opportunities that are available to us. I'm going to just quickly remind, as a community agreement for us, if we're not talking, if we can be on mute in the meantime, that would be great. There will be space for us to participate going forward. So in any case, like 350 of us 2 weeks ago came together to discuss some of these big questions. And I wanted to just start by revisiting and highlighting some of the big themes that came out of our discussions not last week, 2 weeks ago. So on this first question, some of the common themes that came out was that in terms of immediate problems and challenges that young people and youth organizers were facing, there was a number of things that were common across the country that we highlighted. So one was the need for immediate rapid response to ensure that there was meals, particularly distribution of meals for students that would otherwise receive that at school, the need for access to grocery stores, and highlighting also the challenge of food deserts in this time. We also spoke about the need for young people to be able to access technology and the internet, particularly given the fact that, you know, schools across the country have been closed now for a couple of weeks. We spoke about the challenges of unemployment and youth unemployment in this moment, as well as young people in detention centers, prisons or jails, being affected by exposure to the coronavirus and a number of other implications. We spoke about young people being unsafe at home. We spoke about immigrant justice questions around ICE raids being increased during this time, and what the particular challenges for young people were around a whole range of criminalization, which we know we experience even in a time when coronavirus is not a challenge, but now is being heightened for young people, and what some of the challenges of youth organizing in response to those would be. So there was a number of other issues which I'm not going to go through. There's a little bit of a longer list on that, which we can also send to folks at a later stage. But I wanted to also just highlight that for many youth organizers across the country, one of the key issues that came up in almost all discussions was the fact that as organizers, during a period of isolation, much of our work is having to shift, right? Usually we used to organizing on the basis of community engagement, one-on-one engagement with folks is kind of the basis of how we organize, and yet now during social distancing, one of those fundamental things has been removed from us. And so, you know, a buzzword now is digital organizing, which was obviously a key issue that was raised during the last discussion. And I'll make an announcement about how this network and this group of folks are planning to support youth organizers as we shift from a space of having to connect in person often to a space where we can't do that, and what digital organizing in the time of Corona might look like. And so again, I'll come back to that at the end of this introduction, and we'll also speak about it a little bit later as we close today's webinar session. So, you know, on top of the things that we discussed last week, the groups that I mentioned at the top of this call came together and tried to synthesize all of the challenges and ideas for solutions for youth organizers in this particular moment. And basically what we're wanting to present today is a proposal for what the space that we've started to create and that we're engaging in again today, what that might look like as we go forward, right? And so we really kind of pulled out a few basic pillars or themes that we thought would guide us as we continue to build and create this space for each other. And so I wanted to just kind of mention the core grounding pillars of that. So this group identified that in creating this space for youth organizers across the country in this moment of crisis, that we really want to focus on three things. One, we want to create a space for community. Two, we want to create a space for learning. And three, we want to create a space for collective action. All of this being centered around youth leadership, in particular, centering the leadership of youth of color in this moment, but really centering those three themes, right? Space for community, space for learning, and space for action. And so at last week's call, where we had 350 people participating, we identified that we've already created, or we've started to create the space for community and want to continue to do that through the youth assemblies and through some other ideas for continuing connection and community building, even outside of the youth assemblies that we've now set up. Secondly, on the learning, creating space for learning, we want to really center the learning aspect of that in today's webinar, and I'll say in a second how it is that we think we're going to do that. And then thirdly, at the end of this call, we really want to come to a proposal of moving our community that we've created now, some learning and some analysis that we can develop together, and ultimately move that into what we hope to do in our third youth assembly, which is create a space for identifying moments and opportunities for collective action, right? Like, we don't just want to be a building community. We don't just want to be only learning from each other. Ultimately, we want to look at this crisis that we're all dealing with also as an opportunity for collective action towards a vision that moves even beyond the crisis and this moment that we are currently in. And so in today's discussion, we want to really, center that vision for the trajectory from community to learning to action. And out of the themes of things that were discussed, particularly in the small groups and breakout groups from the last session, we identified that, like, what it feels like we need to center in the youth organizing space in this particular moment is firstly, giving space for us to identify what our particular needs around this healthcare crisis currently are, but also identifying that we're not just in a health crisis, right? Like, this is also, in fact, one of the advantages, if you will, of the coronavirus and pandemic has been that it's removed the veil. It's dropped the curtains on bigger social, economic, and political problems, and a bigger crisis, ultimately a crisis of capitalism, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on in today's session. It's not just a health crisis, but it's a crisis of capitalism that we're dealing with. And we need to understand this as both a crisis, but also as an opportunity to build a vision for movement that sees this as a moment of us as youth organizers and people working with young people to be able to see what it looks like to build a movement that goes from crisis to liberation. And so that theme is something that we really want to kind of ground a lot of our discussion that we'll have together today. And so, just want to remind folks that as we move into our small breakout groups and through some of the things that will be facilitated, that we're centering learning today, right? But that we ultimately want to create this as a platform that moves us all towards learning and also creating a vision for what collective action can look like. And so just want to kind of ground us in those themes today. I'll come back to a quick announcement around a virtual training session that we're going to provide specifically around digital organizing for youth organizers in a moment. But before I do that, I just want to kind of run us through and start to wrap up on what the agenda for today's webinar and youth virtual assembly is going to be. So again, as I said, like, our goals continue to be to provide space for connecting and building community amongst youth organizers and young people. We're also immediately after this, before a short activity, we're going to provide an update on coronavirus and the impacts and impacts on youth and the responses that youth organizers are having to that. We're then going to move into a short learning session where Hashim from the Funders Collaborative for Youth Organizing is going to provide an analysis of the coronavirus as a pandemic, but also within the context of the crisis of capitalism. In particular, we're going to be looking at the agenda of the 1% and corona capitalism as that session is going to be described. We'll then move briefly after that into breakout groups, where we'll discuss a few facilitated questions that really touches on the themes that Hashim will highlight for us. And then round that off, again, back to our pillars of, what does it look like for us as a now network of people and youth organizers in particular? Like, what does a trajectory of building continued learning, continued action based on this community that we've now created, what does that look like? And that'll round us off on a report back after the small group discussions. So that's just a quick outline of what it is that we're going to look at today. I think in the chat line, can I see, has it been posted already, the information on the training? There's going to be 2 virtual training sessions led by Social Movement Technologies on digital organizing for youth in this moment. I don't know if anyone, there's a long chat since I've been talking, so I'm not sure if it's, okay, there, right at the top of the chat, Eric Braxton has posted information on the next 2 virtual sessions on youth organizing and digital training around that. And again, we'll come back to that at the end of today's session. So that's my piece. Again, just want to welcome everybody. I see we've now got 170 people that are registered. We might be getting a few more as we go along. But I want to again thank you all for joining us. Ground us in that vision that we're going to learn a bit together, but let's think constantly as we're doing that about how we move from that moment to action. But before we move to Hashim's presentation, again, want to just acknowledge that we are in a moment of crisis, that we're dealing with this both as organizers, as people that are in other aspects of our life, like constantly actually dealing with struggle and crisis nonetheless. But this has an impact on us individually. And so before we go into these kind of bigger systemic things that I think a lot of us are energized and passionate about moving towards, I want to give space for us to just kind of ground ourselves in the fact that we are dealing with a crisis, and let's just kind of acknowledge and give space to acknowledge that before we go into deeper discussions about how we ground ourselves in the bigger challenges. And so before I do that, as I wrap up and thank you all again for joining us, I want to hand over to Jonathan from the Alliance for Educational Justice to give us a little bit of grounding before we move into the next session. Thanks again.
All right, thank you, Dimitri. And so we want to, before we go any further, we actually want to just take a moment and be with what is, and for us to notice, how are you arriving? What's been your week? What's been your time? How are you arriving? And one of the ways that we have found to do that is through the practice of centering. And I see a lot of my bold somrads, some folks from generative somatics. And centering is a practice that has been making its way through youth organizing. Some of my favorite groups are groups that center, like Rethink in New Orleans, if they're on the call. Mad love to them. And it's just a body-based practice that we use to just really get present, open, and connected. We center to embody, we center to feel more aliveness, and we center to organize ourselves on purpose as we, as organizers, organize our communities on purpose and for power. And when triggered, when under pressure, when grabbed, centering offers us a body, place, base to return to in those moments to really get a sense to feel. And so we do that by first, and if y'all are just kind of following along kind of as you're there in your space or wherever you're at, it's really just begin by bringing attention to your body and your sensations. It's nothing to fix, nothing to change. You are perfect just as you are arriving. But just getting familiar with what is. And the quickest way to do that is to return to sensation, to see if you can notice temperature. Where might you be hot? Where might you be cold? Another way, sensation is pressure. Can you notice maybe a part of you that might be tense? Like my lower back is really tight, or maybe a part of you that is really loose. And the third way is through movement. Can you notice a part of you that might be still or moving? One way to do it also is to just take a breath and to listen. See how far you can listen. Can you extend your hearing? And then we focus, we want to move from our thinking selves to our feeling selves. So we want to begin to notice, what are our emotions? How are we doing? How are we arriving? Has it been a long day? Is this your 5th virtual call today? Are you fed up with Zoom? Are you excited to be here? Did you see your favorite youth organizer on the video chat? Just noticing what is, noticing your inner dialogue. How are you thinking? What's the mood or the pace of your thoughts? Are they a rushing river? Are they slow? Is it syrupy, like molasses? It's just been one of those days. Noticing our inner dialogue. And then lastly, noticing our mood. And getting to notice and be with what is present. And with that sensation, we begin to center on purpose. And that means dropping our attention to that space 2 inches below our belly button. And if you like, you can put a hand there and just feel the warmth of your hand or the coldness of your hand there. This is the bowl of our attention. And see if you can, see if there's a little bit more aliveness. See if you can feel from the inside out, from your inner self, bringing yourself out and meeting your hand. And with that, we begin to center on purpose. And we center in 4 dimensions. Our first dimension that we center in is the dimension of length, of dignity. And we do that by expanding down, grounding down, giving more to our feet, to whatever it's touching. If you're seated, relaxing your hips more, seeing if you can give yourself 10% more to your chair or your yoga ball. That's what I'm sitting on. And then extending up, seeing if you can give yourself more dignity. This is the dimension of our inherent worth. See if you could bring your shoulders up to your ears and just drop and allow your neck to be open. That's a source, a place of vulnerability, our life source. What's beating for us. That's right. Centering is not a static practice. You can feel free to move whatever moves you into your body, but our dignity, our inherent worth. And then we move into the dimension of width, of side to side, of connection. Seeing with the next breath, if you can feel a little bit on your left, and then feeling out, extending to a relationship, to someone who maybe you love or you care for. And then extending and rolling from our center of ourselves out to our edges of our elbows on our right side. Maybe someone we lean upon, and extending them energy and attention in that. Even in a moment of social distancing, we know that energy still can be extended. And then we center in our third dimension of depth, of time, our front and our backs. So you can give a little love to your back, your shoulder blades, your spine. And then allowing that to soften us and bring our attention to our hearts, what we care about the most. And allowing that to soften our stomachs, our faces, relaxing our jaws. And breathing, being with what is. And then the last dimension, we center on commitment, on purpose, on what we care about, what brings us together as youth organizers, both in our person, in our leadership, in our movement. What do you care about? And allowing that to fill up our dimensions of length, our dimension of dignity, allowing us to give us our worth, allowing us to feel into our relationships, deepening our connection, and moving us towards what we care about the most. And as we close that, I invite you to share your mood in the chat box, and all moods are welcome, whether you're arriving anxious, excited, thankful, tender, fed up, pissed off, they got me fucked up, whatever that is, we welcome it and we welcome you. Dimitri, does it go back to you or does it go to,
I think we now move to Maria from Advancement Project, who is going to give us an update on coronavirus and impacts on our work and as this group of people. Over to you, Maria.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much, y'all. Again, Maria, she, her, hers pronouns. I work for the Advancement Project and I'm based out of DC. I'm going to do this really quickly because we're running a little bit behind and the juiciness of today's conversation is going to be around capitalism. So I want to get to that. But again, similar to when we were last together, we are not doctors. We are not in the medical profession. We're just trying to gather information as they come and try to put forth some reliable information for you all. So I'm going to run through it because I wrote a lot, but maybe I'll cut some out. So since we were last together, we have seen a drastic rise in the number of people testing positive for COVID-19 and the number of deaths. As of 2 p.m. today, there are 234,768 cases and 5,586 deaths here in the United States. So we have rapidly gone up through the charts, leading globally in the number of cases that tested positive. We heard, as you all probably heard, Congress passed the $2 trillion stimulus package, known as the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economy Security. CARES Act, okay. We know that the stimulus package does not do enough to support frontline communities, our communities, and that in fact it is bailing out corporations and not people. New York City continues to be an epicenter with other cities like New Orleans rising, moving in that direction. This hurts me personally. My family's in New York. This means that our hospitals are overwhelmed. Healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, hospital and clinic staff are fighting for personal protective equipment. They don't have enough. Hospitals across the country are threatening to terminate employees who speak out about the working conditions and lack of PPE, but they're doing it anyway. So big ups to all the healthcare providers that we know, that we love, that are out there doing that work. Jails, prisons, and immigration detention centers are hotspots for the rapid spread of COVID-19. As local jails and prisons report the isolation of several folks who are incarcerated, who have tested positive, like Rikers Island and right here in DC. Organizers are demanding cities, states, and federal government get our people, young people, undocumented people out of cages to ensure that they have all that they need to be healthy and free. So we continue to demand free them all. States continue to close schools either indefinitely or for the remainder of the school year, raising lots of questions about students' grades, promotion, and access to education. There is not enough technology or free and accessible internet services to support all the young people that need it. States and cities also continue to drop their shelter in place and or stay at home orders. Most recently Texas, which dropped theirs today. Many cities are deputizing police to enforce social distancing. And we are seeing billions of dollars going into policing, surveillance technology, and criminalization. But we know that in the midst of all of this, our organizing has not stopped. We just saw this week worker strikes. So Whole Food workers are striking this week for preventive equipment, safety precautions, and hazard pay. Similarly, Amazon had a series of worker strikes in Staten Island. Amazon said they also fired some of the lead organizers. They're saying it was because he violated social distancing guidelines, coming in contact with an infected employee, but we know what the deal is. And folks are organizing rent strikes. Communities are organizing rent and mortgage strikes, demanding economic relief and housing for all. And we've seen most recently organizations drop sets of demands. So the Movement for Black Lives have released their set of demands that center the experiences and needs of Black folks of our communities. Over 500 progressive organizations put forth the People's Bailout, demanded a COVID-19 relief and stimulus package that contribute to just recovery. And we are excited to see how youth organizers are moving, shifting, adjusting, and advancing their organizing under the conditions of a COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. Young people are doing video podcasts, virtual youth and student assemblies, doing virtual exchanges across cities, holding rallies and press conferences, watch parties and hangouts, and are having so much joy in the middle of all of this. And we love to see that, and we love to see it, and wanted to give a major shout out to the Philadelphia Student Union and Bryant Park Neighborhood Council in Chicago, who hosted their virtual youth exchange. It was incredible. So this is so much of the work that's happening. We are getting hit hard, but we are resilient, we are moving, and know that our organizing does not stop. And what this moment does, in fact, is expose this crisis of capitalism, and make it plain for us to see the organizing work that we have to put forth to really come out winning, surviving, and thriving in this time. So that's all the updates we have. I'm gonna put all the links in the chat box of demands, of news articles, and I'll send it off to Hashim to get us started.
Great, thank you, Maria. It was a great setup. And I think important things for us to keep in mind as I go through this presentation and set us up for the small group conversations as we think about how our people are moving and what are the opportunities that are opening up for us amidst this crisis. And just want to again thank you, Jonathan, for the centering and bringing us into this conversation with our full selves and reminding us that we are perfect as we enter. And by being really purposeful and grounded in the moment, we can make the best choices and most strategic choices about how to move forward. So with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And Maria, do you see just my screen and not my notes? Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. So really excited to have everybody on this call. Just so you have a sense of where we're going next. This presentation is going to take me about 20 minutes to get through, and then we're going to go into smaller breakout rooms to really process it. So I've called it Coronavirus and Our Freedom Dreams, how youth organizers can understand the current crisis and seize the opportunities that it creates. And I have three main goals, what I hope to accomplish with this presentation. The first one is to apply an analysis of racial capitalism and neoliberalism to better understand the conditions that were already impacting working class young people of color. So before the crisis even hit, what were we already dealing with and where did that come from? If the terms racial capitalism and neoliberalism are confusing to you, don't worry, I'm gonna offer some definitions. The second goal is to understand how the crisis creates opportunities to advance radical demands for change, as well as be aware of the dangers for even more oppressive conditions. And I also hope to offer a framework for how we can think about how we can use crisis to advance radical demands in this moment. So to start off, let me offer a definition of racial capitalism. This might be a new concept for some of y'all. So what we mean by racial capitalism is a system that we live under that is built around race and class, always working inextricable from one another, reliant on one another. So in this system, wealthy people who are overwhelmingly white gain wealth, profit, and power from the exploitation and oppression of working class and poor people of all colors. But racial inequality is built into the structure of the economy itself. And race and class are always working together to shape policies and cultural norms. So the idea with this framework of racial capitalism is we can't understand capitalism without understanding that it is a racialized system, a system that relies on race and racism to reproduce itself. And we can't understand race separate from the role that it plays in reproducing the exploitative economy that capitalism is. So this is really important because it's important for us to understand that the DNA of the American political economy is and how always has been based on exploitation and oppression. And so in addition to being racialized, we understand that capitalism as a system relies on structural sexism or patriarchy to reproduce itself as well. And that the most recent stage of development of this racialized capitalism in the US and around the world is what we refer to as neoliberalism. Or we can think of this as the successful advancement over the last 40 years of the agenda of the 1%. So the neoliberalism has kind of three core components that if you understand these three things, you basically understand the gist of what neoliberalism is. So I'm going to go through these and talk about to help us kind of ground how this economic and political system of neoliberalism has impacted our communities. So the first core element of neoliberalism is the consolidation and elevation of corporate power. So this means globalization, tearing down trade protections to make it easier for corporations to set up shop in other parts of the world, particularly the global South, where Black and brown people are pushed out of ancestral lands, pushed out of their communities, and forced to work in factories, often under terrible conditions, as well as closing down factories and taking away good paying jobs for the working class here in the US. It means deregulation, so dismantling government policies that are put in place to keep corporations in check. It means privatization, taking things that are in the public good, taking them out of the realm of the public and making them something that corporations can make money off of. And it means attacking workers' rights, unions, the institutions that working people rely on to try to maintain power and protect their interests in the face of dominant corporations. So that's the first major element of neoliberalism. It's the advancement of corporate power. The second core component is attacks on the public sector. This basically means cutbacks to everything that poor and working people rely on. So cuts to funding for public schools, cuts to public housing, cuts to food stamps, cuts to the total dismantling of welfare back in the 90s. So all of these things that had been put in place to protect people from the worst ravages of poverty, cutting back on those essential social service programs and making people more vulnerable to this unpredictable and crisis-prone economy that we live in. The third core element is crackdowns. So if you're cutting back on the services that people need, you're taking away taking away people's jobs. They don't have a viable means for living their lives and producing for their families. What do you do instead? And so what we see is the rise of mass incarceration and policing. We see the further militarization of the immigration forces, increases in deportation. So basically, in a situation where the economy is not set up to take care of people, an increased reliance on state violence as a means to keep people in check. So where they cut back on all the social services, we actually see an increase in militarization of our communities and militarization of the global order. So This is always operating both domestically and abroad. So if someone asks you what neoliberalism is, in a nutshell, you can tell them it means it's about corporate power, it's about cutbacks, and it's about crackdowns. So this is the agenda that has been operating and harming our communities for several decades now. And the 1% has had multiple strategies that they have effectively used to advance this agenda. And I'm just going to touch on 3 of them that are particularly relevant for the conversation that we want to have today. So the first one is to understand that our enemies have been very good about advancing their agenda through the realm of big ideas. So they're not talking about the minutia of particular policies. They're talking about rugged individualism, that everybody can get ahead if you work hard to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. Talking about the free market and how it fixes everything, and we just need to get government out of the way because it's wasteful and inefficient. And unions are bad for the economy and bad for workers. And most importantly, the biggest idea of all is the strategic use of racism. So coming out of the Black freedom struggle and the people's movements of the 60s and 70s, were kind of overt Jim Crow racism and bigotry is no longer acceptable. Our opposition has gotten really good at using race in more covert ways, to the point now where it's not even covert, it's out in the open again. But for a long term, the strategic use of racism is both a way to keep people of color down, as well as consolidate a political bloc that could advance their agenda. And so race was really essential to building what we can call a white united front. So the 1% understood that they couldn't advance their interests if they were just organizing millionaires and billionaires. So racism, sexism, homophobia were strategically used to build a coalition, a multi-class white coalition between the 1%, the Christian right movements, and the white nationalist movements in this country, into a consolidated political bloc that has proven to be pretty durable and very powerful at advancing their policy agenda. The second major strategy that they've used is the use of crisis, and that's really the crux of what we're going to be talking about today. And so one of the architects of neoliberalism, Sky Milton Friedman, had this to say about crisis. You're going to see this quote again in the video clip I'm about to show, but just to make sure we're kind of reading it and rereading it to understand how important it is. He said that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. I believe our basic function is to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive, until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. So the idea is that crisis creates opportunities where the things that you wanted to do, the radical ideas that had no chance of getting by, suddenly become possible, suddenly become the thing that people want more than anything. And those are the opportunities to advance what we call structural reforms. And this is the third major strategy that they've been very effective at. So the idea is to think about policies that you put forward that actually change the rules of the game. In the case of privatization, kind of the major structural reform, changing the rules that make it easier for private companies and for-profit institutions to take on services that were normally typically paid for or covered by the government. And starting by reforming smaller services, things that people aren't really paying attention to and don't really care that much about as long as they get done. So things like trash collection, things like parking lots. And as you do that, you start to set the precedent for, in this case, privatization, till we get to the point where they start going after schools, the rise of charter schools, the privatization of prisons, the privatization of utilities, till we get to the place where we are now, where everything's on the table, even things that are extremely popular programs like Social Security. You know, 30 years ago, the idea of privatizing Social Security would have been laughable. And today it's something that is offered even by some Democrats. So, you know, moving this agenda has meant that We have seen a radical increase in the wealth and concentration of wealth in the hands of the 1% to the detriment of our people and our communities. And we have to understand that what this represents is an all-out class warfare against working people, as they have worked to consolidate wealth and power in their hands. And they have moved not just an economic agenda, but they have moved a racial agenda to reinforce their position in this society. And this process over the course of the last 30, 40, 50 years creates the conditions for what we're experiencing today with the coronavirus. Capitalism as an economic and political system is inherently prone to crisis. It goes through waves of crisis. And what this system of neoliberalism has done is made our communities particularly vulnerable because of those cutbacks, because of the lack of a good, strong economy. When we get hit with something that's unforeseen like a coronavirus, we know that our people are the ones that are most likely to suffer that pain. But while the 1% agenda creates the conditions for the coronavirus, we are also have the opportunity to influence what the long-term economic and political consequences of this crisis are, if we have a good orientation and if we're ready to act. So with that, I'm gonna show a little video. It's about 8 minutes long that kind of reinforces this understanding of how crisis creates both strategic opportunities as well as dangers and threats that we need to be prepared for. Maria, give me a thumbs up if you hear the audio once it starts going.
Ideas that are lying around. Friedman, one of history's most extreme free market economists, was wrong about a whole lot, but he was right about that. In times of crisis, seemingly impossible ideas suddenly become possible. But whose ideas? Sensible, fair ones, designed to keep as many people as possible safe, secure, and healthy? Or predatory ideas, designed to further enrich the already unimaginably wealthy while leaving the most vulnerable further exposed? The world economy is seizing up in the face of cascading shocks.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
In the wake of the coronavirus crisis, stocks have stopped trading on Wall Street after a 7% drop.
This is a historical day, the biggest drop we've seen since that crash in 1987.
The drop was spurred by a growing oil price war as the market was already weakened by coronavirus fears.
Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all.
In the midst of this widespread panic, corporate lobbyists of all stripes are, of course, dusting off all the ideas they had lying around. Trump is pushing a suspension of the payroll tax, which could bankrupt Social Security, providing the excuse to cut it or privatize it completely. An idea that has been lying around for a very long time.
A worker at his or her option ought to be allowed to put some of their own money in a private savings account.
Lying around on both sides of the aisle.
When I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid.
And then there are the ideas being floated to bail out some of the wealthiest and most polluting sectors in our economy.
We are working very closely with the cruise line industry, likewise with the airline industry. They're two great industries, and we'll be helping them through this patch.
Bailouts for fracking companies, not to mention cruise ships, airlines, and hotels, handouts which Trump could benefit from personally. Which is a big problem because the virus isn't the only crisis we face. There's also climate disruption, and these industries that are getting rescued with our money are the ones driving it. Trump has also been meeting with the private health insurers.
We're meeting with the top executives of the health insurance companies.
The very ones who have made sure that so many Americans can't afford the care they need. And what are the chances they don't have their hands out? It seems like the whole pandemic is getting outsourced.
Well, Mr. President, thank you for inviting us here today, along with our colleagues from Walmart and Walgreens and our partners at CVS. Normally, you'd view us as competitors, but today we're focused on a common competitor, and that's defeating the spread of the coronavirus.
The Fed's first move was to pump $1.5 trillion into the financial markets, with more undoubtedly on the way. But if you're a worker, especially a gig worker, there's a very good chance you're out of luck. If you do need to see a doctor for care, there's a good chance no one's going to help you pay if you aren't covered. And if you want to heed the public health warnings to stay home from work, there's also a chance that you won't get paid. Of course, you still need to pay your rent and all of your debts, medical, student credit card, mortgage. The results are predictable. Too many sick people have no choice but to go to work, which means more people contracting and spreading the virus. And without comprehensive bailouts for workers, we can expect more bankruptcies and more homelessness down the road. Look, we know this script. In 2008, the last time we had a global financial meltdown, the same kinds of bad ideas for no strings attached corporate bailouts carried the day. And regular people around the world paid the price. And even that was entirely predictable. 13 years ago, I wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine: The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It described a brutal and recurring tactic by right-wing governments. After a shocking event, a war, coup, terrorist attack, market crash, or natural disaster, they exploit the public's disorientation, suspend democracy, push through radical free market policies that enrich the 1% at the expense of the poor and middle class. But here is what my research has taught me. Shocks and crises don't always go the shock doctrine path. In fact, it's possible for crisis to catalyze a kind of evolutionary leap. Think of the 1930s, when the Great Depression led to the New Deal.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In the United States and elsewhere, governments began to weave a social safety net, so that the next time there was a crash, there would be programs like Social Security to catch people.
The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate medical care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health.
Look, we know what Trump's plan is. A pandemic shock doctrine featuring all the most dangerous ideas lying around. From privatizing Social Security, to locking down borders, to caging even more migrants. Hell, he might even try canceling elections. But the end of this story hasn't been written yet. It is an election year, and social movements and insurgent politicians are already mobilized. And like in the 1930s, we have a whole bunch of other ideas lying around.
Do we believe that everybody should be entitled as a right to health care?
Yeah! We will not stop organizing and fighting until all unhoused folks who want shelter have shelter.
Canceling student debt.
It makes so much sense that if you're sick, that you should not be penalized where you don't have an income.
Many of these ideas were dismissed as too radical just a week ago. Now, they're starting to seem like the only reasonable path to get out of this crisis and prevent future ones.
Now, here's something that helps explain the difference between the testing situation in South Korea and the U.S. The South Korea, like European countries and Canada, has universal single-payer insurance, and that means that it's easier to mobilize, and also people know what to do. There is pretty much one answer for how to get testing. The U.S. is a patchwork of countless different systems, and so you can't say, here's exactly the steps that every American should take in order to get tested.
And with Washington suddenly in the giant stimulus business, this is precisely the time for the stimulus that many of us have been talking about for years.
Today is the day that we truly embark on a comprehensive agenda of economic, social, and racial justice in the United States of America.
It's called the Green New Deal. Instead of rescuing the dirty industries of the last century, we should be boosting the clean ones that will lead us into safety in the coming century. If there is one thing history teaches us, it's that moments of shock are profoundly volatile. We either lose a whole lot of ground, get fleeced by elites, and pay the price for decades, or we win progressive victories that seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. This is no time to lose our nerve. The future will be determined by whoever is willing to fight harder for the ideas they have lying around.
So we know that which way things go on the back end of this crisis or any crisis in large part has to do with how well our people are organized, how well our movements are able to mobilize. And we understand that the political leadership of working class young people of color is particularly critical. We know that young people of color often are the best freedom dreamers. They have the most radical imaginations. They have the most to gain from a transformation of the system. And there are many reasons why they are poised to play a critical leadership role in an intergenerational movement that can actually transform conditions. So what I want to do now is just offer a framework for what kinds of fights, what kinds of organizing should we be thinking about as we move through this coronavirus crisis. So if we think about this within the framework of from crisis to liberation, and what we're called on is now is the time to make structural demands that attack the very root of racial capitalism itself. This is a time for us to uplift liberatory narratives that really paint the picture of the world that we're trying to build. And we know that we're going to have to build our bases at scale. So we need campaigns that are going to bring, excite and mobilize our people by the millions, and are going to resonate with people outside of our communities. So we have to form those longer term strategic alliances that can give us the political force to win the transformative policies that we know that we need. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan, who's going to give us the instructions for how we want to have conversations about this stuff in our breakouts.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hashim. And I just want, before we get into breakout groups, just for us to just, again, take another breath. That was a lot. And just getting what really present with your body again. That could be really heady. Political education could be heady. It doesn't have to be. We think the kind of download, but we also want to take a moment to digest. We also, if you have some burning questions or reflections, this might be also a time to offer those as we start to move towards groups. And so what we're going to be doing in the groups, to steal a phrase from one of my favorite youth organizing groups, the Dream Defenders, we're going to ask the question, can we dream together? You heard Hashim talk about freedom dreams, and that's one of my favorite Robin D.G. Kelly books, amongst all of his books being my favorite. I just want to fangirl Robin if you're out there. But we really want to take the time to be as creative leaders, shaping new tomorrows that really transform the material and political and spiritual conditions of our people. And as Hashim says, kind of move us towards action. Also, in addition, kind of one of the quotes I thought about for this one is in Asada's autobiography, she talks about how dreams and reality are opposites, and that is action that synthesizes them. So what is the action that we need to take to synthesize this very stark and grim reality with the freedom dreams that many of us carry? What is the make the demand that will make the struggle, as Ella Baker taught us? What is that alternative institution, that alternative way that now we would assert or affirm should be the way? So we're going to take I think we're going to be in with each other for about 50 minutes in small groups to really, again, kind of take a moment to check in with each other, discuss kind of what's been happening in your part, as well as a move towards what is possible. What are some of the structural demands that we should be making that, as Hashim kind of lays out, does those three things, moves us closer towards liberation, excite and mobilize our folks, and resonates with folk outside of our communities, again, in that kind of freedom tradition, right? That we are clear that our liberation is tied to others. So what are those demands, those ways of organizing that invites others who are also seeking liberation a way in and a way to connect our struggles? And so are we almost ready, Hashim?
Yeah, just a quick word. If you are on the phone and using your phone as your audio, link your phone to your video. If you don't know how to do that, just stay in the main room. I'll put up a quick tutorial before you go into your breakout. And then facilitators, I'm pretty sure I have you all set up and distributed across 15 breakouts. So once you get into your room, if you're doubled up with a facilitator, just hop back and we'll figure it out. Likewise, for participants, if you get into a breakout and no one announces themselves as the facilitator after a minute or so, send somebody back to the main room and we'll get it figured out. With that being said, the rooms are now open.
Right. Happy discussions, everyone.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Hope folks had some good conversations, and I believe we're now going to pass it off to Thina, who is going to lead us in a quick report back before we move to close.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me. Just wanted to really open up space for groups to kind of, share out some of the solutions, some of the ideas that you discussed in your small group. Joined here by my son. He might press buttons.
You're being upstaged, Thina. You're being upstaged.
Yes, I am. He's much cuter than me. But yes, this is really just an opportunity to please use the chat box if you'd like to share out from your group. I was in group 12. Amazing, amazing ideas discussed. We also held a little space for folks to share maybe what was keeping them up at night, which I think is critically important as we move forward. But really just wanted to open up some space. So I'll pause and just turn it to folks who want to chime in.
This is Dimitri, can I give two quick ones from our group? Because I thought there were some dope ideas that came out. And I'll just try to do them in punchlines as they came out. One was like, in terms of like actually we were all talking about structural ideas and moving from crisis to liberation. So just a few kind of like comments that came out. Like one was, y'all got money for $1.2 trillion economy bailout, but don't got money for reparations. What the fuck? Two was, at another time when it's not a crisis, our schools don't have any access to nurses, but suddenly y'all can provide nurses to us. What the fuck? Three, everyone's talking about stimulus package and bailing out and providing support to the youth, but there's no youth voice in determining what that looks like. So where's the youth self-determination? What the fuck? Those are our three straight up questions. I hope I represented our group proper.
Yeah.
I like the couch pose at the end of it.
Would other facilitators like to chime in, reporting back from what you heard in your amazing groups?
Sure, I'll report back from group 10. I think I was in 10. I forgot the number, but 10. Our conversation was a lot about kind of one of the things that I think was around the entire conversation is this idea of crisis, and that actually for our communities are always in crisis. and that it takes a particular crisis to expose the systems that don't work for us. So there was a lot of conversation around privatization, particularly, and kind of the privatization of education in this moment, the privatization of policing, and this idea that in a moment of crisis, we allow an authoritative government, thinking that like the boosting of policing and all these things are gonna go away once the quote unquote pandemic is over, but it's not, right? This shit is for good once it's built. So there was just a lot of conversations around that and kind of demands around human rights, housing as a human right, freedom to move as a human right, education as a human right.
I'll go for group 11. So yeah, we had a lot of the similar conversations around major structural demands for the economy, like, you know, all the things that were just mentioned: unemployment insurance, housing for all, a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, canceling student debt, abolishing ICE. We talked about the impact of a lot of the changes for undocumented folks, what it's going to mean for an undocumented person to have to choose between their safety and their freedom and getting vital resources to keep their family going. We talked about this moment and as we discussed earlier in the general group, sort of the radicalization of the general public and what this moment is going to mean for being able to take our message to folks who we might not typically be able to take it to. But then even in that, thinking about what it's going to mean for folks who don't have the privilege or the access to technology to be able to get on calls like this. How are we going to bring these conversations back to our folks in a way that's going to be productive and useful for everybody? And so similar, a lot of the same conversations a lot of other folks had. We had some folks talk about new podcasts that they're putting on as a way to reach new folks, and just trying to be as creative as we possibly can in the virtual space, thinking outside the box and finding new ways to communicate with people.
Yeah, I think everything that our group talked about has basically been touched on. Like, we talked about getting our communities to recognize and to demand sustainability instead of scarcity, and just really pushing for a removal of the barriers in place. So we talked about getting security with healthcare and education, job security, voting security. I used the example in Philadelphia of how we're trying to like push against the digital divide right now. So demanding that our school district holds these corporations that don't pay taxes accountable to funding laptops and free internet access for our students. And that they're not just doing it as a loan, but they're actually doing it to provide support for our students who are already so behind with how the school district is set up. And then even calling out like the contradictions that were mentioned earlier of how going into this pandemic, students had already been talking about there not being soap every day in the bathroom, no toilet paper, the daily resources, nurses, and how we see this as an open shot to really call out all the contradictions with funding and the lack of funding for nurses and counselors and just school hygiene and holistic support comparatively to policing and criminalization. And yeah, if I missed anything from our group, feel free to jump in. But yes, group 5, thank you.
I'll jump. Go ahead, Jamie.
Sorry, Anna. I was going to invite Marissa from our group, Group 4, to jump in and share some of our group's conversation.
Thank you, Jamie. So we talked a lot about education reform and how we can hold different spaces accountable during this time in untraditional ways. So we really talked about how it's okay to be upset about the capacity at which this is going, but at the same time, the holy structure is accountable for like being like this, and that it's not okay to let people suffer just for profit. And so we talked about what access to meals looks like for students now that are living in food deserts. We talked about the horrible media messaging of students that they basically said like youth won't be affected, and now like, oh, it's a horrible virus. How do you go from not being affected to a horrible virus and letting those people being really the most vulnerable among us, and what that looks like to help those folks during this time. And we talked about finding a way to give students internet access and making sure that they have the tools they need to excel during this time, like other groups talked about, and making sure that we control spaces. I'm sorry, that's my timer. But having spaces for students during this time for their mental health and making sure that they're okay. And that was group 4.
Hi, I'll jump in for group 14. We had a lot of conversations around the impact and relationship to the criminal justice system on young people in this moment, and the increased police presence and what that might mean as they're like building more and more police moving forward, as well as the education system. Like what will, now that they're moving to online and now that the response is so kind of differing across the board, like what will education look like after this? You know, the school closures, the possibilities of kind of keeping those as public spaces as a challenge. And then also the differences between rural, urban, you know, and folks in very rural places, access to food, and the dependence on other states. Like we had somebody from Alaska on getting food into their communities, and that while folks might die of the virus, there's a real potential for folks to die of food insecurity and other things. And as we started to end, we were talking about like what something national would look like. I think Roxy dropped it in the chat, the 10 point, what is the 10 point, what the fuck campaign look like or plan. So, you know, wondering like what could then be moved towards action, like that on the flip side of that, folks are a bit in conversations with more organizers across the country than they've ever been in with before. And so there's an opportunity, like, is there a way to create some sort of 10-point plan or some sort of demands on a national level that of course are derived from local and led by groups on the ground, and like how to hold that as a container. So I'll leave it there.
These are so incredibly powerful, and I just seeing all of the different comments being dropped in the chat box here. Thank you all. I know we're going to be sharing out both the recording of this along with notes. There is a poll that just popped up, so we are actually thinking about the next conversation. So actually, Hashim, I'm going to turn it to you if you want to explain the poll a bit, and then we'll be wrapping up in just a second.
Sure. So two things. One, you know, we have at least one other virtual assembly that we want to do. And our hope is that folks actually take some time and have a similar conversation back with your organizations. So if we're thinking about trying to put together a national program with structural demands and even coordinated action, we want to make sure that we are engaging as many of our people as possible. So yeah, let us know. Is this a conversation you would want to take back with your organization and facilitate the same kind of conversation about how to seize the opportunities in this crisis? And we'll be sending out a facilitation guide for how you can do that in a virtual meeting sometime early next week. And then also just wanting to know like how much time people would need before they'd be ready to come back for a third assembly, because the idea is in that third assembly, we'd be kind of synthesizing those ideas. Like Dimitri said, that next one is really about what kinds of collective action are we prepared to take.
All right, so I have a little one who's turning up over here. So Hashim, I'm also going to pass it back to you to help us close out, and any other final words.
Sure, I think, so Eric, if you're still on the line, can you we had a couple announcements for additional work FCYO is doing to support this process?
Yes, so I just dropped in the chat one thing, and I'll drop another in a second. There's two things that FCYO is doing right now. One is we heard on the last call a lot of people talking about needs around digital organizing. How do we operate our organizations remotely? How do we organize folks digitally? So we're going to be partnering with a group called Social Movement Technologies to offer 2 webinars next week. I'll put it in again here, so it's at the bottom of the chat so you can see it. So on the first one is going to be on Thursday, April 9th, 3 to 4:30, and the second one on Friday, April 17th, 2 to 3:30, both of those Eastern time. So we should have the registration live probably by the end of the day today. So look out for an email from FCYO, or go to our website at www.fcyo.org. And again, we know a lot of folks are really looking for good tools about how to organize digitally and how to function, have your organizations function while we're still on lockdown like this, right? So Social Movement Technologies has a lot of really good tools on both of those things. First webinar will really focus on how to help your organization function internally, and the second one will be more on like external organizing strategies. So they've got a lot of expertise on that stuff. And then the second thing, which we want to make sure folks know about, is that FCYO is going to be creating a rapid response fund. We are putting some funds out just to make small grants for folks either to help sustain your organizing work or to make the pivots that you're doing to support your communities. We have an initial pool that's not huge of $50,000 to put into this, so we'll be making $2,000 grants that people can use for technology. If you need to buy computers, you need to buy Wi-Fi stuff, or if there's other ways that you need to make pivots in order to respond in this moment. We know these are small grants. We know the needs are much bigger than that. We're committed to trying to work with you all to raise more money for that kind of work over the long haul, but this is something that we can start to put out now in the short term. So you can check out our website for more information on both of those things. The application for the rapid response is really brief, 2 questions. So it should be pretty simple. So look out for an email and updates from us on both the webinars on digital organizing and the rapid response. And we're excited to be continuing to partner with folks in any way we can. And thanks for all the work that you're doing.
Great. So I'm going to end the poll. So it looks like there's a lot of interest in hosting this conversation back in people's organizations by a margin of, what is that, 2 to 1 almost, or 2/3 of the group wants to come back sooner rather than later. So y'all trying to keep it moving. So the coordination team, the organizing team that has been putting these on together, we'll be meeting tomorrow to debrief, and then we'll send out emails with the immediate next steps. Looks like we might be coming back together on the 23rd. And like I said, we want to get that facilitation guide. If you want to host a similar conversation with your folks, out by early next week. Any other things that we need to name before we close, facilitation team?
There's a question around the notes from the first session on the chat box. So I know we have that, so I wanted to see how we can share that out with folks.
Yes, Kate, are you about to say something?
Yeah, the notes are in the slides that we started last time. They're summarized at the top. So when we send out this information, we can bump that back up for everybody so they can see those summaries. And you can also, if you want to dig through and see some of the details of what other groups said, they'll be included in the same document.
And then I did have the last kind of announcement that we wanted to share. I shared it in the beginning, but I'll try to find the link again. The Rising Majority has a really incredible kind of teach-in tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern with Angela Davis and Naomi Klein, who was the woman author of Shock Doctrine that spoke on the video Hashim said. So it's kind of centered around a left feminist perspective. So it should be amazing. And I'm going to try to find the link real quick to share. Oh, thank you. Someone did it. To share it out. And if you all have capacity tonight to join, it's going to be incredible.
All right. Well, I think that about does it. So much appreciation to everybody who took time to be in this space and help hold and build this space with us. Much appreciation to all the facilitators, your work to make this happen. Let's keep it moving, y'all. Incredible opportunities in front of us. Let's do our work and let's transform the society. And with that, we'll close it out. Peace, y'all.
Peace.
Thanks.
It's our duty to fight for our freedom.
And our duty to win. What the fuck, y'all?
We must love and support one another. What the fuck?
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
What the fuck?
What the fuck?
Hold on. Huh? Thank you.
I can't with y'all. Are we staying behind? Okay.